for the church service, we're going to focus on Assyria. Kind of backwards because Assyria came before Babylon, but anyway, we decided to do it that way this time around. I'm going to tell you a story that I've only told one other place publicly. Is that okay? This is a story that happened when I was about 14 or 15 years old. I was in 8th grade, and our 8th grade teacher had a plan to give us work experience all around the community in which I lived, where I grew up, which was Berrien Springs, Michigan. Some of you know it as the home of Andrews University, and I was 2 months old when we moved there and lived there until I graduated with my first master's degree. So anyway, we worked in various businesses all around the community on Wednesdays. It was a volunteer program, but it actually led to my first paid job when I was 15. This was not the job that I received, though, on one of these jobs that I had. I took this picture up north in Northern California a few weeks ago when I was up there speaking because I needed a dirt road. I was assigned one of these jobs. It was a nursery, Twixwood Nursery. And when I arrived there for the first day, they handed me a broom and they said, "You're going to go out and you're going to sweep the dirt road." There were no leaves on the dirt road. There were no pine needles on the dirt road. It was just a dirt road. And I was like, why am I doing this? Well, you don't ask those questions when your boss tells you to do something like that. But after an hour in the heat, I was wondering what on earth I was doing. Sweeping a dirt road, just making more dust. I wasn't cleaning anything. I was just sweeping something that was already looking kind of like this. And I have to say something that's one of my embarrassing moments. I walked off the job. At 15, I walked 3 miles back to the school, the elementary school where I was going to school, and I didn't turn back. I thought, I'm not going to do this all afternoon. It's an embarrassing moment in my life. God sometimes has a sense of humor because my profession has been to sweep dirt most of my life. And I will tell you that I've thought about that a few times over the years. I can tell you that a lot. It is one of the dustiest and dirtiest jobs. On Monday, I returned from a 3 or 4 week excavation in Cyprus in the Mediterranean. And I tell students when we go, there's something that happens on a dig that you will never experience anywhere else. You will never be as dirty anywhere else as on a dig. I mean, that dust gets in everything and every place. And the best part of the day, always, yes, is finding that artifact that you thought you would never find, but is actually the shower that happens at 1 o'clock after you're done getting up at 4 a.m. and working on the hours of the morning. That shower feels just absolutely amazing. I mean, just look at some of these pictures. These are pictures from our digs in Israel over the years. I mean, look at that. That's the reality of what it looks like some of those days. This is my good friend excavating there, Dr. Ken Matthews, and you can see the ambiance all around him. So when our children were small, we taught them early not to do what I did when I was 15. They started digging early in life. And here we have, this is us in Cyprus. Sarah is 4 and Daniela is 6. And we lived on the island of Cyprus for a year. Back in 2005, I had a Fulbright fellowship there, and it was a wonderful time. But yes, they're digging sand here. It's not quite the same thing. But here they are on their first dig. Sarah's digging with Giselle. Not digging, she's dusting a dirt road. What do you know? An ancient one. And anyway, we had a lot of fun over the years taking our kids on these digs and growing up, and they grew up in that part of the world. They call it their second home. By the way, I just want to mention this again today. Seeing the Jerusalem stone here behind us takes us right back to Jerusalem, where that's the building code for every single building that goes up in Jerusalem still today. So, and it's the same stuff that Herod used when he expanded the Western Wall and the Temple Mount area. So yeah, we find all kinds of exciting things. We move buckets and we find artifacts, and sometimes working on these ancient sites. This city, Lachish, which I'm going to talk about in our next presentation, 18 cities superimposed on top of each other over millennia of history. It's like digging in a giant haystack and looking for what? That needle that you are looking for with, and you can dig here at a site like this for years and decades. We had a 5-year project at Lachish in the southern part of Israel. How many of you have been to the site of Lachish or Lachish? I know several of you have because your pastor takes you to Israel, and you guys are lucky to have a pastor that takes you to places like this. It's a wonderful experience to be there. So I had the privilege, we had the privilege, it was an amazing thing. I can't tell you the whole story today, but to get the license to excavate and co-direct this site with the Hebrew University, 70% of the staff and students came from Southern, the other 30 to 40%, I know that's off statistically, but anyway, came from the Hebrew University, and we worked this site for 5 years. It was an amazing, thrilling experience, and sometimes it pays off. All that grit, all that dirt, all those days and months and years pay off in the end. Giselle was telling our friend Trina, who's a member of the church here last night, or sharing the story again with her because she's a family friend, about how she went up to the site one afternoon and all by herself and prayed on the site. Because you don't know what you're going to find when you start working at a site like this, and you're only digging a small fraction of a fraction of a fraction of what could be excavated. And we're putting, $250,000 into every season to excavate these places and bringing students from all over the world to work there. And it's a big investment, and you want to have some results from that work, right, when you're done with it. And so it was the first day of 2016, and that's the shirt I still wear when I dig. I had a washing machine this time, so I washed it every day. Anyway, and Catherine Hessler, the square supervisor, one of my students who's a PhD student now at Lipscomb University, the first day of the excavation, she found a small little object. I actually brought it here with me, and I want to pass it around. I'll start with the pastor because I know he won't take it. No, I'm kidding. It's not the original. It's a replica. It's a replica. But just pass that around. This is a tiny, tiny little object. It came up out of the dirt. It was encrusted in dirt. She didn't know exactly what it was. She thought it looked a little bit like bone, so she stuck it into one of our bone bags. And then the zooarchaeologist, the guy there that was in charge, Dr. Maher, who was looking at all the bones and analyzing all the bones, we dig tons of bones up every year as well. He cleaned it during our siesta time in the afternoon, and as he was cleaning it, he noticed, wait a minute, this is not just a bone. This is elephant tusk ivory. And it's not only elephant tusk ivory, it's been worked, and it's actually a tiny little comb. A comb about this size, this big. You'll see it, you'll have it in your hand in a few seconds, a replica of it. Sometimes you sweep long enough and work hard enough, and when you do that, my father invented a word, I don't know he invented it, but he always said, son, daughter, stick-to-itiveness. That's what you need in life. You stick to something and you persevere until you accomplish something. Well, sometimes it's just providence, sheer luck, I don't know, but this is what we turned up that day. 2016, first day of the excavation project. And it wasn't until it went into a little box that went off into a warehouse in Jerusalem, actually my colleague Yossi Garfinkel's office. And then during COVID in 2021, Dr. Madeline Mamshuglu, one of our co-workers, a scientist, a virologist, a pharmacologist who works in labs. Anybody ever hear of the immune supplement that you can buy at every drugstore here called Sambucol? It's a elderberry extract. Anybody ever hear of that? She's the founder of that company. She patented elderberry extract in 1991 in Basel, Switzerland, and founded a company that now her son runs. So she's a multi-millionaire, and in her second career decided to do archaeology. So anyway, she was looking through a microscope at her home and suddenly saw scratches on this comb, this tiny little comb that you're going to see coming around, this tiny little comb, and she said, those are letters. Could that, I've got a neat thing here. Could that thing there be the letter Tav that we get our T from, that X up there? And what about this letter over here that has a head and a body and a tail? Can you see that tail? It's upside down. That's Kof. That's Kof in Hebrew means monkey. That's the first. Anyway, she took a picture with her brand new iPhone 13. She sent it off to Daniel Weinstub, an epigrapher, a language expert at Ben Gurion University of the Negev. He says, that's definitely an inscription. I'm going to come up and see it in person. I get an email shortly thereafter because it was found by one of our students in our area, and we began to write the introduction to an article. We worked on it very hard. In October that year, 2022, it was published, and this is what it says. The earliest alphabetic sentence in history was found on this little tiny comb, using the alphabet that we still use today, an earlier version of that. And here you can see the inscription, 16, 17 letters, and it says, "May this ivory tusk root out lice of hair and beard." It's a tiny little comb. It has tiny little teeth on one side, wider teeth on another. I was giving a lecture at another university on this a couple of years ago, and a lady comes out of the audience. She worked in an NICU unit, and she says, "We still give combs like that to our mothers who just had little preemie babies. They have same kind of thing." And it's from the plastic age. It's made out of plastic today, but it's not that much different. We announced it at Southern Adventist University in November of 2022. The press release went out, and our phones did not stop ringing for 3 days and 3 nights. Almost felt like Jonah and the whale kind of thing, you know? We had calls from all over the world. 3-hour interview with the science editor of the New York Times, Smithsonian, CNN. 40 different agencies picked this up. An interview with an Indian television station in India through Zoom. It just went crazy, and this became something. Of course, it's just a couple days on the news. It even made National Public Radio. It's incredible. Why? Because it's the first time a system of writing that we still use today, that 75% of the world's population still uses today, was found, the earliest form of that alphabetic writing, with a complete sentence, verb, subject, two objects, on a comb, found at a big Canaanite site in the country of Israel today. And why is that important for biblical studies? Because Moses didn't write the first 5 books of the Bible in Egyptian hieroglyphs. He didn't write it in cuneiform, which is the language of Mesopotamia, which you'll see some examples of today. He wrote it in an alphabetic script, and scholars for centuries now have doubted whether Moses could have written those first 5 books of the Bible, because if the alphabetic system wasn't invented yet, hadn't been developed yet, that would have been a problem, right? This dates 200 years before Moses. And if somebody could write a banal, common little sentence like, "May this tusk root out the lice from the hair and beard," on a little tiny object, which was a luxury object at a major site like that, couldn't they have written more sophisticated literature than that back then? So this has major implications, and that's why it made all these news places. In other words, these scholars who claim, up to the 2020s, this decade, that the books of the Bible, the earliest books of the Bible, were only written in 200 BCE or BC. Sorry, I was giving this lecture at a Jewish university recently. BC, what on earth is happening here, And so now we have it going all the way back much further. In fact, these are inscriptions that we found at our sites over the last several years that we've excavated at Kirbet Kayafa, at Kirbet El Rai, and the Lachish Jar inscription, tracing alphabetic writing from the time of David and Saul all the way back to the patriarchal period. Very exciting. Now I'm getting to my subject for today. Sorry, I'm running out of time, but here we are. So sometimes it pays off, right? I've never been to Babylon. I've never been to the country of Iraq or Iran. My father was there. I grew up hearing stories of this when I was a kid. Every Friday night, my dad was an avid photographer. He had a Nikon F3, which is the best camera back in the day. And he would go around the world on his various trips, and he would take slides, 35 millimeter slides. Does anybody remember what those are? Anyway, and we would have slideshows on Friday night to welcome the Sabbath. And my favorite, mission stories and different things. He would travel for various reasons. And my favorite was always the Middle East. This was my introduction to this world. And my dad would share stories about this. So I've never actually been to these places, but I've studied them most of my life. And last night we talked about the 2 things that make the Bible unique. compared to any other religious text of any modern or even ancient world religion. And the first of these was, and we talked about this last night, that the Bible is constituted in history. The Bible simply assumes that there is a God who intervenes in human history. From the very first verse of the Bible, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, to the very last verses of Scripture and Revelation, we have a God who intervenes in history, sending prophets. We're going to talk about these events relating to Babylon and Assyria today. Winning battles for the people of God, destroying, in some cases, the enemies of God, and so forth. And all of these things purport to a God who is active. And the ultimate, of course, act in history was Jesus coming into this world, God sending forth his Son to die a death that we might have life. The second thing that we're going to focus on more today in this presentation and the next one is that, this is the second thing that makes the Bible unique, is that the Bible consists of almost 30% prophecy. You don't have that in any other world religion. Because as we said last night, in the cyclical view of history, when the circle of life or the cycle of life where history simply repeats itself over and over again, you don't have a linear view of history that has an absolute beginning at the beginning in Genesis 1:1, and that continues on after the fall with a hope and a promise of a Messiah and a resolution to the problem of sin. That does not exist in any other world religion, except in the Judeo-Christian faith. And the Bible has prophecy because a God who is actively at work in history is telling his people those things that will take place in the future. Are you with me? So this is a really exciting thing that we have to share with the world. People are looking at the world today, wondering why these things are happening around us today, what reasons and what's behind it all. Sometimes we have all kinds of weird conspiracy theories, and sometimes the greatest insight that we have as a church is the great controversy and this battle between good and evil that has been raging for so many years. And without a linear view of history, prophecy is not possible. In a cyclical view, that simply, it doesn't matter what happened before or what happens later. History doesn't matter quite as much. The assumptions of prophecy are this. Prophecy assumes that God is able to communicate future events that cannot be known or predicted by human beings. You and I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. We can guess, we can plan, we can make future plans for our lives, but you and I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. We don't know whether a diagnosis is going to come down the road for us tomorrow or the next day or the next month. We don't know whether there's going to be a car accident. We don't know what is going to take place, but God does, and he is able to predict the future and let us know what will take place in the future. Number two, his knowledge is perfect concerning the events that will take place in the future, seeing beforehand the outcomes of decisions made. Now, this is a mystery to us, because if we have the freedom of will and the freedom of choice, how can there be this at the same time? It's one of those mysteries that we can't completely wrap our mind around, but God has it in control, and we can trust in him. And number three, that God ultimately has a plan and purpose in mind for his people. And he has given us 350 promises or prophecies of the Old Testament just regarding the Messiah and his coming. The first time when he came to Jerusalem many years ago and saw these stones, and the time where he is going to be coming again very soon. So as we go into the book of Daniel, which we have studied as a church for many years, it's fascinating to see how prophecy comes out in this book. It was a couple of years ago that my dean at the School of Religion where I teach asked me, after a professor left, to teach the book of Daniel. I had not done that before, but it has become my favorite class to teach, and I teach it every semester to our theology students and as a general education class as well. I have a waiting list. I could teach 2 sections every semester with the waiting list that I have, but I can only accept so many students. The classroom only seats so many, and it's a wonderful class to teach, and I've really been able to delve more deeply into it. Of course, the city of Babylon, we think of the Tower of Babel, where Babylon probably gets its name. This is a famous painting by Bruegel, I believe. My wife would know this better than I do. I think a Dutch painter from long ago. And it was, of course, Robert Koldewey, the German archaeologist from Berlin, who began excavating at Babylon intensively in 1899 until the period of the World War I. uncovering the ancient walls of the city and finding all kinds of things. Now, I didn't come with it this time because I've been having trouble with TSA, and I brought a few artifacts with me today. But I didn't bring this one. I have a brick that my father brought back from Babylon, 2 pieces actually. And one of those bricks both of those bricks are significant because they have stamps on them. Here is one of these stamps that you can see here on one of these bricks. You can see the cuneiform. They were just stamped with these stamps, thousands and thousands of bricks. The early scholars, before Koldovay excavated, thought, how could Nebuchadnezzar claim to have built Babylon, as he does in Daniel chapter 4, verse 30, if in fact the city existed for over 1,000 years before he even reigned? It's kind of like the mayor of Los Angeles saying, is this not great LA that I've built for the glory of my majesty and honor? Right? You'd kind of laugh at that, right? Somebody's laughing at that right now. Like, yeah, that's not going to happen. I don't want to get into any local politics here, by the way. I'm just saying, I know there's a race right now for that going on, or maybe it ended. I don't know. I've been traveling. But anyway, so all of a sudden he finds these bricks. Koldovay and his team find thousands and thousands of these bricks, and they're all stamped with this stamp. And what does the stamp say on it? Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, builder of the temple of Esagila, and Ezida, eldest son of Nabopolassar, king of Babylon. Have you ever gotten into a fight with your sibling and saying, your name is not on it? What makes you think that toy is yours? Well, they wanted everybody to know that he was the builder of that city. Nobody doubts today that Nebuchadnezzar was the builder of Babylon. He rebuilt it after the Assyrians destroyed it a few decades earlier. It was a magnificent city. It was a sprawling city. In comparison to all the ancient capitals of the world, I was in Athens this past Sunday. I mean, Athens was just a fraction of the size of Babylon. Babylon was about 4 square miles in size. For an ancient city, that was huge. The downtown area of Athens, the Acropolis and the Forum and all of that area was less than 0.2 miles. It was just a sprawling city. The river Euphrates passed right through it. You can see the ziggurat or the temple tower in the distance dedicated to Marduk, the chief Babylonian god. It was a huge city. It had huge, huge walls, double walls, 22 feet wide. Herodotus tells us that 2 chariots could race on top of the walls around the city. If they wanted to, it was almost like a racetrack of some sort. It was an incredible place, the Temple of Etemonki. And of course, punctuated by 8 huge gates, each gate named after one of the Babylonian gods, different gods. The most famous one, of course, is this one, the Ishtar Gate, which was taken apart piece by Koldovay's team. Here they are, packing it all up in ancient Babylon, taking it to Berlin, and the scientists reconstructing it there piece by piece. How many of you have been to Berlin and seen it in the museum there? Don't go now, by the way. The museum is closed for the next 5 years or so while they're refurbishing this whole area. So you have to go a little ways from now. But this creature, there's bulls, there are lions, but this creature is very interesting. It doesn't actually exist. It's a composite creature of different parts. You see the hind legs are talons of an eagle. The 4 paws are of some kind of a leopard. The scales across the body remind one of some kind of a dragon or a snake. The dragon has horns. There's something coming out of his tongue. There's a close-up of it. You can see. You know what the guy's name is? It's a cute little endearing name. Mashushu. Can you say that with me? Mashushu. Isn't that cute? The dragon's name. There was a movie some years ago, a movie entitled "How to Train Your Dragon" or something like that. Have you ever? Don't watch it. It's okay. But it makes the dragon seem very, very cute, but he wasn't cute. What is the dragon called in the Bible in Revelation? Satan, right? And by the way, it's very interesting because this dragon was trained by none other than who? Marduk, the chief deity of Babylon. Here we have a quote regarding this from a very important source by Vigamon, Mesopotamian Protective Spirits, the ritual texts. The Mashushu was the sacred animal of Marduk and his son Nabu. By the way, what is at the beginning of Nebuchadnezzar's name? Nabu. the son of Marduk. That's who Nebuchadnezzar, that's the theophoric element that Nebuchadnezzar is named after. During the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the dragon Mashushu, whom Marduk once vanquished, became his symbolic animal and serpent. You always see there's Marduk standing, and there is the horned serpent or the dragon Mashushu. It's interesting, isn't it? Here we have another text with a star constellation. You see the star there. You see this dragon, this winged dragon with a lion pounced on top of it. By the way, when you have something on top of something else, what does that mean? That means subjugating something else, right? So the lion is subjugating the dragon, riding the dragon, if you will. Isn't that interesting? What does the Bible describe in Daniel 7? How does the Bible describe the entity of Babylon? As a what? As a lion. And by the way, that was what Babylon was known for. On the processional way leading up to the Ishtar Gate, 120 lions, along with on the gate itself, depicting the symbol that represented Babylon all the way through. We could go into a lot more details. So when Daniel and his friends, I like to call them Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. I don't like to call them by their Babylonian names. That was an attempt by the king to make them good Babylonians and change their religion, by the way, in a subtle way, maybe not so subtle way. But when Daniel and his friends arrived, maybe not all these buildings were built yet, but they were built during his time. Daniel would have seen these massive gates being constructed by the person that had just captured them, the prince in 605 BC in his first campaign, who would become the king in that same campaign when his father Nabopolassar died. And that's what these boys would have experienced. Boys, I say, because they were probably 17 years old, 18 years old. We have to extrapolate based on how old Daniel was as he goes even into the Medo-Persian Empire and becomes a very important ruler and official in that period of time. He was probably in his late 80s at that time. Daniel lived a very, very long life. So from Daniel chapter 1 all the way through, we kind of get this experience of these young men and how they experienced this place. And I could go on and on about that aspect, but I won't today. How did such an incredible kingdom fall? We know that Babylon fell, right? We know that Nebuchadnezzar had a dream in Daniel chapter 2 of an image. We're going to talk about that image in a moment, of a head of gold, an arms and chest of silver, of thighs of brass and bronze, legs of iron and feet of iron mixed with clay. And he accepted Daniel's interpretation and Daniel's recollection of that dream very clearly in Daniel chapter 2. But in Daniel chapter 3, what does he do? He says, I don't want to be just the head of gold. I'm going to erect a statue that is huge on the plain of Dura, and it's going to be entirely gold, and that's my kingdom. It's going to last forever. I'm going to defy what God shared with me the future is going to be, and I'm going to make my own future based on what I believe and what my counselors have told me should be the case. And so we have this event at the plain of Dura. Nebuchadnezzar, that was Daniel 3, and Daniel chapter 4, what happens? Nebuchadnezzar is humbled. And after he brags about this great place that he has built, by the way, I just came back from the British Museum a couple of weeks ago where we're going to, I hope, have a number of very key artifacts illustrating all of this for our museum that we're going to have a special exhibit on called Babylon Rising, Innovation, Conquest, and Destiny. I have to be careful. I want to use the word prophecy, but when you're working with secular institutions like the British Museum and the Peabody Museum at Yale, you have to use careful language, right? We can always use different language when we give the tours in the museum. Is that right? Is this being recorded? I have to be careful what I say here. All right. So anyway, next week on Monday, as soon as I get back from this trip, I'm going to Yale, and I'm going to be visiting with Klaus Wagensonne, the curator of the Yale Babylonian Collection, the largest Babylonian collection in the United States. We've worked with him 3 times already on previous exhibits for our museum. He's a good friend. And I hope that he's going to give us what we're asking for, which will include some really important stuff that you're going to see here now in this next few minutes. So Belshazzar's feast, by the way, so Nebuchadnezzar, what does he do? He humbles himself, right? He is made to be like a wild animal in Daniel chapter 4. It's a wonderful chapter. By the way, let me just show you something here that I brought. I'll just show you this too. Hopefully that comb is out there somewhere. I do want it back if possible. This is a replica. This is not the real thing, but I've requested it from the British Museum, the real thing. Now, I'm going to tell you in a few minutes what this is, but before I do that, somebody once asked me, what would be the most important thing that you would love to find as an archaeologist? I love the book of Daniel. Daniel's one of my favorite characters of the Bible. Anybody resonate with that at all? When our daughter was born, our firstborn daughter, we didn't know. The ultrasounds were not very specific, shall we say, even though we had several of them done. And so we didn't know whether we were going to have a boy or a girl. And when Daniela was born, we were delighted that she was a healthy young baby girl. And so it was going to be Daniel, or that was a 2-hour conversation at the hospital, Daniela. But how was it going to be spelled? Danielle with an E, like most Americans spell it. My wife is from Brazil. I'm German American. We need to make it work in 3 different languages. How's this going to work? So we settled finally on an A, and Daniela has been thankful to us ever since because nobody has that name around her. They're all Danielles, and she's kind of unique as a result of that. But anyway, that's besides the point. So what we have here is Daniel. And Daniel, I love, people have asked me what was the most important thing you could ever find. I'd love to find a document like this, because when you read Daniel chapter 4, it's the conversion story of Nebuchadnezzar, but it's written in the first person, and it's sent out as an edict to the entire land, and it was probably written on one of these. Probably was. It may still be in a basement of some museum someplace, maybe even the British Museum, because only a fraction of the tablets have been translated over the course of the history of discoveries. Most of these kinds have been, these barrel inscriptions, most of those have been translated. I'm going to put this away before I drop it. But yeah, so that's Daniel chapter 4. Daniel chapter 5 tells us the story then of how the kingdom fell. What did I do with my? Oh, here it is. Belshazzar's feast. We know the exact date because those details are given to us in the book of Daniel. Belshazzar's feast, October 12, 539 BC. I love this painting. It's supposed to be Belshazzar's feast. It's quite elaborate. It's quite large. It's quite ostentatious, but it was something like this. The Bible says Belshazzar the king made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords, and he drank wine in the presence of 1,000. And while he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father, Nebuchadnezzar, had taken from the temple which had been in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. Were they supposed to drink from the vessels that were in the temple of the Lord? This was seen as a blasphemous act. And Belshazzar knew what he was doing, by the way, because if you actually tally up all of the kings of the Babylonian Empire, Nebuchadnezzar lived and reigned for 43 years. There were no term limits back then. 43 years. And if you add up all the kings that came after him, they add up to just over half of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, all of the rest of the kings combined. Nebuchadnezzar could truly be considered the great king who built everything up. Many times people who build things up and leave them for others, those others don't take things as seriously as the people who built them up do. From classical accounts, we don't know who Belshazzar was. The Bible is our only account, actually, over the course of history. And thank you. How could Daniel be elevated to the third ruler? And who was this Belshazzar that the book of Daniel is talking about? Who was this person? And how could Daniel be elevated by this Belshazzar? Because all the secular sources that we have, the classical Greek sources, mention Nabonidus as the last king of Babylon. And as archaeology has taken place, it is confirmed that Nabonidus was the last king of Babylon, but there's no Nabonidus mentioned anywhere in the biblical text. And this has caused a conundrum over the years for scholars who question whether Daniel was accurate in his description or not of this king called Belshazzar. Well, the mystery was solved in the 1800s by a British fellow by the name of Taylor, who excavated around the edges of the corners of this ziggurat at Ur. By the way, this ziggurat was built before Abraham lived, and Abraham probably would have seen this in the horizon of Ur as he lived in this particular city. This is a picture that I got, by the way, recently because Pope Francis visited Iraq for the first time in the history of the Catholic Church recently, and he came to this site. Why would the Pope come to this forsaken place in the desert in southern Iraq? Because he wants to unite all the major world religions under one religion. And he knows that if he comes to this place, the birthplace of Abraham, Abraham is considered the father of the three great monotheistic religions, which are what? Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, right? And he met with imams here as well. Sorry, that's an aside. So the artifact I was just holding my hand is the replica of this artifact, by the way. It's the same size that I had in my hand a few seconds ago. And this was found by Taylor, George Taylor, as a foundation deposit in a corner of the ziggurat of Ur, placed there by Nabonidus the king. And this first cylinder of Nabonidus offers a prayer to Shamash, the sun god. Last night we talked about Ra, the sun god of the Egyptians. They worship the sun god here as well. By the way, all these mythical religions of the ancient world worship a plethora of gods. That's the other thing that makes the Bible unique. There's only one God in heaven, right? There's only one God in heaven. And pretty soon as we go through this narrative, we'll see he even writes on walls. Only one God in heaven. And so this is what it says. As for me, Nabonidus, this is what this text says. As for me, Nabonidus, the king of Babylon, who reveres your great divinity, may I be sated with happiness in life. Moreover, with regard to Belshazzar, my firstborn son, my own offspring, prolong his days, may he not commit any sin. Similar requests are made on other documents that have subsequently been found, like this second cylinder that is believed to have been written at the end of Nabonidus' life, either in his year 13 or his year 17, written to the moon god Sin now. By the way, how do you remember the name of the moon god Sin? It's a little mnemonic advice I'm going to share with you. It's always a sin to worship Sin, the moon god, right? You don't worship moon gods. You worship the God of heaven who made the moon and the sun. By the way, in Genesis, the name for the sun and the moon are never mentioned in Genesis chapter 1. They're simply called the greater light and the lesser light. And Moses did this on purpose, I believe, as a polemic against these ancient gods, because he wanted to make clear that these were not deities. If he would have used the Hebrew word shamash, or shemesh in Hebrew, it's the same word as shamash in the Akkadian, in the Babylonian language, that is the name of the deity, which is the name of the sun. And so he didn't use those names of the moon and the sun because those would be mistaken for deities. He simply calls them the greater light and the lesser light, and then he gives them the functions that those luminaries are supposed to give. Very interesting, isn't it? In this text it says of Belshazzar, have the fear of your great divinity, the moon god, placed in his heart so that he does not commit any sin. May he be sated in happiness in life. So again, Belshazzar is mentioned now in multiple texts. We're going to bring some of those, hopefully, to our museum. But what we do know from history is that Nabonidus was sent off into exile. Well, that's not true. It was a self-imposed exile. He wasn't sent off to exile. He decided to go to a temple that he had built on the far opposite extreme border from Babylon as possible, in the middle of this Arabian Shield, in the middle of what is today Saudi Arabia, where he worshipped at the moon god's temple at Tema. And this is Tema over here, by the way. It kind of looks like Petra. There's similar things there. But he goes there to Tema, and there he worships for a number of years. We have the verse account of Nabonidus from the British Museum. These are all on my requests from the British Museum. I don't know if I'm going to be able to bring them here because the insurance on this stuff is outrageous. And I want to have it for 2 years because if we put any money towards it, I want to make sure that we have it for a period of time. Some of these objects have never traveled to the United States before, by the way. But these are the key objects that show that the Bible is accurate in what Daniel's describing here. It's really fascinating. This is the verse account of Nabonidus. And this is what he writes about his worship in Tema. This is fascinating, this text. It says, he had made the image of a deity, that's the moon god, which nobody had ever seen in his country. in this country. He introduced it into the temple. He placed it on a pedestal. He called it by the name of Moon. It is adorned with a necklace of lapis lazuli, crowned with a tiara. Its appearance is that of the eclipsed moon. The gesture of its hand is like that of the god Lugal. Its head of hair, it had hair, by the way. They put hair on these statues. Okay? The head of hair reaches to the pedestal, and in front of it are placed the storm dragon. Did you get that? The what? The storm dragon. We just talked about the dragon a moment ago. And the wild bull. Both images, by the way, are on the Ishtar Gate as well. And when he worshipped it, its appearance became like that of a demon crowned with a tiara. Don't think for a moment that these religions were simply worshiping, statues. These statues, you can read it here. This is the text telling you what happened to these statues when they were worshipped. They were possessed, if you will. The power of the forces of evil were there in that place. And we can see this described here in the verse account of Nabonidus by the king himself, who spends 10 years in Tema worshiping this deity that he created for himself and which had this power. But the verse account mentions something else that is very interesting as well. And this is what it says. He, Nabonidus, while he was gone in Tema, trusted the camp to his oldest son, the firstborn. Who was that according to the text we just read? Belshazzar, right? Belshazzar of Daniel chapter 5, mentioned 5 times in the book of Daniel there in chapter 5. His son, the firstborn, the troops everywhere in the country, he ordered under what? Under his command, he let everything go, entrusted kingship to him. He turned towards Tema, deep in the east. The text tells us. He basically says that the king left to worship the moon god Sin. By the way, one of the objects I'm going to request from the Yale Museum, the Peabody Museum this week, is another barrel inscription like this, where Nabonidus is dedicating his daughter to be the chief priestess of the moon god Sin. Interesting, right? Like father, like daughter, like father, like son. So here's Belshazzar. Here he is, entrusted to the kingship. He is the co-regent. His father's away for 10 years. Belshazzar's running things in Babylon at the end of Babylon's history. And he is the one that throws this party for 1,000 of his lords and brings out those vessels. We're not going to bring this from the British Museum. It's too big. It's made out of basalt. It's about this large. The shipping's going to be outrageous. This is Nabonidus worshiping. You see what he's worshiping up there? What's that half crescent? The moon, and in front of that is the sun. Yeah, of course they worship Shamash as well. And all of that is there. And here you have Babylon up there, and here you have Tema. You see it? So that's where he was, on the opposite side. So that's the story. That's the background of the story. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple of the house of God, which had been in Jerusalem. And the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. And then we know something happened, right? Suddenly there was handwriting on the wall. A hand simply appeared, not attached to anything else. I would have been a little afraid there, wouldn't you have? And it begins to write on the wall. And the king, this is Rembrandt's rendition of this, the king's countenance changed, his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his hips were loosened and his knees knocked against each other. That's a very nice way of translating it. He basically soiled himself. He was so scared. Okay? Let's get to the basis of what the Hebrew says here. He is scared to death. He's never experienced anything like this before. He doesn't know what it says. He doesn't know what it means. The text, Mene, Daniel then comes, we know. I'm not going to tell you the whole story. You know the story. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. By the way, Mene is repeated twice in the inscription. Why twice? Because there are 2 kings, Nabonidus and Belshazzar, and both of them are judged with the judgment of the handwriting on the wall. Mene, Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, some scholars believe this is actually a reference towards Persia, because Persia is the next empire, Medo-Persia, that's going to take over. Your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. And so that very night, as they're feasting, and as Daniel is being regaled with gold and a purple robe, the armies of Cyrus are surrounding Babylon. And of course, Babylon has nothing to fear. It has a 20-year food supply. It has double walls. It is the most secure city that has ever been built in history. But something happens. The river, some months earlier, has been drained because Cyrus the Great's horse drowned in the river, Herodotus tells us. And Cyrus was so upset with the river that he says, I'm going to destroy the river. And he tells his troops to dig all these canals and spread out the river. And so the Euphrates is very, very low as it flows under the walls of Babylon and through Babylon. And the troops are able, Herodotus tells us, on October 12th, 539, to march on the riverbed through the gates which have been left open, and they are walking into the city. Without a fight, they take over the city of Babylon that night. Isaiah predicted this in quite some detail in Isaiah chapter 44. I am the Lord who says to the deep, be dry, and I will dry up the rivers. Who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he shall perform my pleasure, saying to Jerusalem, you shall be built. In chapter 45, thus says the Lord to his anointed. The word for anointed is Mashiach. That's where we get the word Messiah. Yes, Cyrus, a heathen king, becomes the Messiah of God's people, to give them their freedom and to return them to Jerusalem. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have held, to subdue nations before him and loose the loins of kings, to open before him the double doors so that the gates might not be shut. And that's exactly what happened as the people marched into the city. Nabonidus had deliberately chosen to elevate the worship of the moon god Sin. It was a deliberate practice to return to the worship of the Babylonian god instead of worshiping the God that Nebuchadnezzar had converted to and had proclaimed throughout the entire kingdom. Do you not think Nabonidus and Belshazzar knew about this God? Of course they did. Daniel chastises Belshazzar because he says, you knew, and yet you did these things. Two different worldviews are being confronted here. The great controversy is being played out in this chapter of Daniel, chapter 5. The idea of pantheism, that God and everything is one, and every element of nature is worshipped as God because nature is God, the cosmos is God, and yet there's a distinction between that worldview, which permeates still today, by the way, in many religions around the world, and even in our secular culture and what is produced just up the road here. All of that still exists. There is another worldview that says God is separate from his creation. God is the creator of all things. He is separate from creation, and the two should never be mixed up. Nature is never worshipped. It is the God who created us that is worshipped. And we worship him today on the Sabbath day as a commemoration of who he is. The assault of the Persians against Babylon began on the 15th of Tishri, according to William Shea, a physician trained at Loma Linda, later became an excellent biblical scholar and ancient Near Eastern historian. The full moon, he writes in his commentary, was visible in the horizon, but that night, the full moon was up. But the moon god Sin had no power to prevent the attack of Cyrus because there was a hand at work that had promised something would take place years earlier, and God never forsakes his plan. He prophesies what is going to happen, and when he prophesies something is going to happen, it happens. And Cyrus, who is mentioned by Isaiah 150 years before he exists, how's that possible? It's not possible if you don't accept a divine intervention in human history by a God who relates things to prophets to share them with us of future events that would take place. Cyrus, who is mentioned by name, comes. This is an image of him, very rare one. This is an object that I would love to get from the British Museum, but we're not going to get it. $2 million is the insurance price on this one. But it says, it's the Cyrus cylinder, it says, from Asher and from Susa, Agade, Ashnuna, Zaban, Metarnu, There, as far as the region of Gutium, the sacred centers of the other side of the Tigris, whose sanctuaries had been abandoned for a long time, I returned the images of the gods who had resided there to their places, and I let them dwell in eternal abodes. I gathered all their inhabitants and returned them to their dwellings. Among those was the children of Israel that were allowed to go back again to Jerusalem. A decree that Cyrus gave. Isaiah 13 says, Babylon, the glory of the kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldeans' pride will be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. It will never be inhabited, nor will be settled from generation to generation, nor will the Arab pitch tents there, nor will shepherds make their sheepfolds there, but wild beasts of the desert will lie there, and their houses will be full of owls. Jeremiah, the contemporary of Daniel, says in chapter 51, verse 37, Babylon shall become a heap, a dwelling place for jackals, an astonishment and hissing without an inhabitant. A friend of mine who was trained at Loma Linda University and was a flight surgeon in charge of all the medical operations in 2003 of the incursion into Iraq, Major Tom Murray, came to our campus shortly after and gave us a lecture, and he said, I was flying in a helicopter over the terrain of the southern part of Iraq, and as I looked down, I saw ruins down there, and I said to the two generals that were in the helicopter, that's down there. They said, what are you saying, soldier? What did you say? I said, it's down there. What? What's What are you talking about? It's where Abraham came from, and we're sitting at Olive Garden, and he says to me, the generals responded, and they said, Abraham who? And Dr. Tom Murray, who was trained at Loma Linda and happened to know something about archaeology because he took a class there that had some biblical history and biblical studies, he said, Abraham of the Bible, the guy that kind of got us in the mess that we're in today. And they said, oh, that Abraham. Is that an important city down there, soldier? Yes, sir, it is. Well, that made me upset because we had told our professional organization, we had hundreds of signatures from scholars around the world asking the U.S. government, the Pentagon, to please protect these very historic sites over there. And I was very upset to hear that when he told me this. But anyway, he said, yes, that's down there. And then he said, well, are there any other cities that we should be able to protect? Bless this doctor's heart. He says, yes, of course, Babylon. And the general said, okay, we're placing you in charge of Babylon and in addition to 17,000 civilians and the entire expeditionary force and their medical care for this incursion in 2003, the first 6 months. And so he stationed himself in He says, as I was there in the first nights living in Uday, Saddam Hussein's son's bedroom in his palace that he had built overlooking the ruins of Babylon, he says, I heard, as I read through these verses from Isaiah and Jeremiah, I heard jackals and owls hooting and screeching and howling in the ruins of Babylon. And I had chills going up and down my back because I was experiencing prophecy being fulfilled today. Babylon was never rebuilt, even though Saddam Hussein tried to rebuild it. I don't have much time for the story I'm going to tell now. 7 minutes, Pastor, right? I've got 7 minutes. This is my grandfather, Franz Hasel. This is the book that my aunt wrote about him and his story. He was a pastor serving in the front lines of Germany during World War II. Drafted like every other able-bodied man, he went into the army not wanting to really be in the army again. As a teenager, at the age of 18, he had served in World War I. He had been a sharpshooter, but since that time, he had had a conversion experience. He had become a pastor in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and he had decided, I'm not going to kill any longer. My business, according to the calling that God has given me, is to save lives. And so this is the family before the war. Kind of blurry, but that's my grandmother, Helena, and my grandfather. It's my dad sitting on his dad's lap, Gerhard. Kurt in the background, Lotte. Lotte is still alive, by the way. She lives in Northern California. She's 92 now, I think. After the war, after the 1930s, when my dad always says I was born on the wrong side of the ocean at the wrong time of Earth's history, things began to happen in that part of the world, and my grandfather was the first person, one of the first individuals to be called up to serve because he had served in World War I. He was 40 years old when the war started in 1939, and he received his draft notice. This is his VAPAS, his Army passbook. We have the copy. I made photocopies of all of it some years ago. You can see he was born in 1899. That's him at 40 years of age as he's reporting for duty. He was given an officer's weapon, a pistol like this, and he decided when he was stationed in France during the first part of the war to go to a place where he had it carved. He had a wood carver carve an exact replica that was painted in black, and he put that in that holster hidden by that flap and carried it for the next 6 years. I asked him one time, I said, Opa, why would you not be carrying your gun? You're an officer in the Army. He says, because I knew how to use it. And I knew that in the adrenaline rush of a battle, my instinct would be to use it. And I didn't want that temptation to be anywhere close to me. So I got rid of the temptation, and I carried a wooden gun instead. For 6 years, he carried that gun. That's my grandfather there at the beginning, 1941. Later, in 1941, he was stationed on the East Front, marching through Russia. We found these pictures, by the way, in 2004. My uncle, Kurt, my dad's older brother, the oldest boy in the story, he found all these pictures, 100 of them that my grandfather had kept as the clerk of the unit. So I scanned them all, and I have them all. That's their unit. That's how they marched into the heart of Russia, 25 kilometers a day of marching. They were a bridge-building engineering unit. The Russians had destroyed the bridges so the Germans could not advance, so they built pontoon bridges across rivers so that they could advance. This is a pontoon bridge across the Dnieper River. My Ukrainian students say I slaughter the name, but anyway, that's the major river in Ukraine. It's, by the way, where everybody's fighting right now as well. And that's the bridge and that's my grandfather standing in the foreground as they're building that bridge. One day, the commanding officer called my grandfather into his makeshift office. His name was Captain Mikos, and he said, "Do you think Germany is going to win this war?" My grandfather knew that this was a tricky question, because if he would answer yes, as every able-bodied soldier was expected to answer, every patriotic soldier was expected to answer, he would not be true to his conscience, because he had studied the Bible, he had studied its prophecies, and from the prophecies and from his work and study, he knew that Germany would not win the war. You say, well, how could he know that? Because God knows all things, and he gives us details in his prophetic word that guide us in this life that we live in, give us hope for the future, and help us to understand what is taking place right now. And so he prayed for a moment, because he knew this would be a life and death answer that he would give, and then he got an idea, and he said, "Sir, is this an official or an unofficial question?" And his commanding officer thought for a moment, and he removed his hat, which was an unspoken rule among the officers that if you weren't wearing your cap, you could talk about things unofficially. He removed his cap. He told my grandfather to do the same. My grandfather reached into his pocket, pulled out his small worn Bible, opened it up to Daniel chapter 2, and for the next hour and a half gave him a Bible study on the image of Daniel chapter 2 that Nebuchadnezzar had seen. He had this little piece of paper that we still have in our family folded inside that Bible, and he opened it up, and he used that to share with his commanding officer, Captain Mikos. A head of gold and arms and chest of silver. You know the story. Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome, and the feet of iron mixed with clay. And he said, as the feet of iron mixed in clay are the European nations that have broken up after the fall of the Roman Empire. And that's the period that we're living in today. There have been repeated attempts to unite these nations. You know the history. There have been attempts to unite these nations. In fact, the European monarchies of prior to World War I tried to unite them through intermarriage. Napoleon Bonaparte tried to unite them, and Hitler now is trying to unite them, but none of them have succeeded, because God's word that saw all of these kingdoms come and go, just as was predicted, will be true to this day as well. Germany will not win this war. There will be not a Reich that will last 1,000 years. And with that, his commanding officer thanked him, dismissed him, but before he dismissed him, asked him for the Bible. My grandfather reluctantly handed it to him, and he said, "You're dismissed. You may go." And my grandfather left. That night he prayed. He says, "Lord, may the words that I spoke today not return void and empty." And then he prayed, "Lord, and please restore me to your word, because I don't know how I'm going to survive these days during this war without your promises and without studying your word." And with that thought, he went to sleep. A couple of days later, he was called back into his this office. And this time there were 2 other high-ranking officers with his captain, Mikos, who he didn't recognize. Evidently reinforcements had come in. He didn't know who these people were. And his heart sank. He thought, I'm doomed. I've just been betrayed. And at that moment, his commanding officer took off his hat, told everybody else to do the same, handed my grandfather back his Bible. He says, you're going to explain everything again in the presence of these 2 men without leaving out one detail. And so another hour-and-a-half Bible study took place, just as we just described. And at the end of that, as he got to the punchline that Hitler could not win this war, that there would be no 1,000-year Reich, as he had promised, no Third Reich that would last 1,000 years. These men, he noticed kind of every time he mentioned a detail and dates, Babylon 605 to 539, Medo-Persia 539 to 331, and 334, all these things, he noticed kind of an imperceptible nod among them, but he didn't know what it meant. And all of a sudden, at the end of the Bible study, his commanding officer said, I would like to introduce you to these 2 men. He named them. And he says this gentleman was a professor of history. He named a very leading university in Germany. He says this man confirms all the details that you've provided here today. And this gentleman, before being drafted into the army, he was a gymnasium, a high school history teacher. He has confirmed all the events that you have described here today. He dismissed those 2 men. He said, Hasel, you stay by. If you're right, and evidently you're right, we have to make preparations for the march back home. If we're not going to make it to Baku on the Caspian Sea, where the Russians had all of their oil reserves, that was their goal, in the southern flank of the Operation Barbarossa. If we're not going to make the city of Baku, you have to provision everything. You have to make sure we have enough gasoline. You have to make sure that we keep enough food, and we're going to have to make it 2,000 kilometers back behind American lines if we're going to make it. We do not want to be captured by the Russians if we're going to lose this war. And so my grandfather was put to work, and they made it behind American lines, just in the nick of time. In Austria, not quite to Germany. There were so many casualties in that unit, Unit 699, that my grandfather was assigned to, that 4,000 men rotated through a unit of 1,200 men in a matter of 6 years. Of the original 1,200 men that had been assigned to that unit with my grandfather, only 7 survived. Only 3 of those men were never wounded. One of those was my grandfather. One was Captain Mikos, and the other one was the cook. But that's another story that we'll have to share some other time. This is a list of those names that my grandfather still had of the original 1,200 men. You can see his name highlighted there with his address. And I just want to end with this. We can be certain in the prophecies of the Word of God. And as we study history together with those prophecies, as we look at the biblical evidence through archaeology, through history, that is only possible because we have a God who intervenes in history and a religion that can study these things. I said last night, you're not going to find an Institute of Hindu Archaeology anywhere, or Taoist archaeology, or Confucian archaeology anywhere, because those are esoteric, ideas that are up there that are not rooted in the life and the history of God's people. But the Bible is different. The Bible relates that there's a God in history who has intervened in human history, who continues to intervene, who has made a promise. He has sent his Son once. He is coming again. May we be ready. Amen. Let's pray. Gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for your word. Your word is truth. And as Daniel finished his explanation of Daniel chapter 2, and his explanation in Daniel chapter 2 of this dream, he says the vision is true and the interpretation thereof is certain. May we have the certainty today in this world of relativism, in this world of pluralism and ideas, may we have the certainty that we can trust in what you say.